So thank you all for being here, and welcome to the next in our webinar series. And we're going to continue with our normal fireside chat style of thing that Phil and I have been doing. For those who are here for the first time, Phil is our National Compliance Manager, and my name is Ashley Shield. I'm one of the Executive Directors of Jonge. So today we're going to talk a little differently. Normally we're dealing in a lot of numbers and a lot of technical stuff, but today when you're dealing with people in distress and helping them come up with solutions and helping them deal with their issues, there's obviously quite a human side to that, and the personal and emotional stress that it can be very real. And if it's not addressed or dealt with as you go through one of these processes and dealing with people, it can become a real issue. So our focus today is not going to be on the numbers. It's going to be more on dealing with some of the more the emotional and personal side of how we deal with these things. So I'll hand over to Phil so that he can start to quiz me on various things.
Here we go again, Ashley. These seem to roll around really quickly, mate. It seems like yesterday we were here doing one of these. They
do, yes. Yeah, every 4 weeks becomes very quick, doesn't it?
Yeah. So before we dive into today's topic, since we last spoke, have there been any updates or developments that are worth talking about now, Ash?
Look, there's not a lot, Phil. I think everyone here would know that the JobKeeper is now ended. We anticipate that most people will get their final payment from the JobKeeper either this week or next week, depending on how quickly they do fill in their forms. And that's pretty much the end of the stimulus package from that point of view. There are some smaller targeted ones for the travel industry that most people would have heard about, but predominantly the support, the financial support that was provided under the JobKeeper program has come to an end. And the other big one, which didn't get anywhere near the press as the JobKeeper, is that a lot of the state protections around rental relief are now gone. So they all finished on the 31st of December. 31st of March. So some states it happened earlier, but predominantly 31st of March was where that ended. So those final safety net features that have been in place have now all come to an end, and we're back in the world of playing on our own 2 feet.
So really, Ash, nothing too major or exciting there, and nothing that people aren't already talking about. Is that right?
No, that's it, yeah. I think the big thing, though, Phil, is that it often takes the ending of something for people to start looking at what to do next. What are some of the issues, how to do it? We found quite a lot that people weren't willing to openly communicate and talk to us, particularly about some of their concerns, because they were worried that they may lose JobKeeper if it got found out that they were talking to someone or getting some advice. So we found that by these coming to an end, hopefully some of those conversations will actually start now, and people will talk and look at what the risks that they have going forward are. So the safety net and the protections that are there, while they're there, people didn't want to talk about anything else. They were just in survival mode. So we found that, obviously with the rental relief coming off now, having to deal with landlords will become a more significant issue. Needing to deal with, debt collection calls, something as simple as debt collection calls. People haven't received those really for the last 12, 15 months. So now that that's come off, some of those calls will start coming, some of the letters will start coming that will start putting some pressure mounting. And most of the bank holidays are now over, so the bank are really, really aggressively trying to get involved with trying to help people who were still in that holiday mode.
Yeah. So when it comes to bank Ash, I've got a little bit of experience in that. Did you want me to have a little chat about that?
Will do when you get to the right section, mate.
I'll jump ahead. So what are we up to now, mate? So pressure's coming back on. A lot of the holidays are over. The stimulus has ended. Landlords might start getting interested. Fair to say that the heat's going to start rising?
Yes, it will, but probably not quite as quick as some people are trying to infer, particularly in the press where we talk about this tsunami. So tsunami of insolvencies. I think some businesses will be in trouble today. And, just by the end of the JobKeeper, they know that they're not going to be able to fund their wages. There will be those businesses that are going to need to do something straight away. But for a lot, it may actually still be another 3, 4, 5, 6 months before it gets serious and before it starts becoming a real problem. For those who've got ATO debt, the ATO is only going to start their collection process now. And I think it's important coming into this next phase of our recovery is understanding what that is. So, in a very brief sense, if it's related to ATO, it's an uncontestable debt because you're the one who's actually telling the ATO what you owe. Yeah. So they have the ability to go straight to a creditor stat demand or to a bankruptcy notice if it's a personal debt. So but even by issuing a creditor stat demand, if they haven't done any demand letters or anything before, there's still a 21-day period that someone's got to deal with once that stat demand's issued. And then after that, if there's no response to the CSD, then they need to go and get a wind-up application or a sequestering order through the courts. And then before that hearing comes up, it can be another 4 to 6 weeks. So even if someone's going to aggressively go after someone today with an uncontested debt, you're still looking nearly 2 months before any fatal thing happens. If it is contestable, so if it's your creditors or if there's rent, landlords and stuff like that, they've actually got to go through a longer process. They've got to go through a statement of claim process, default judgments, all those sorts of things. So there's a number of steps, and that can mean that it's 3, 4, 5 months. And if we're dealing, and that's very similar process, different names, but very similar process for both personal and corporate. And landlords have to go through a process. They can't just cause grief tomorrow. Even if they want to change the locks, there's a process that must be followed. So a lot of the time, you're not going to see things happen instantly. But first steps of things, if a creditor stat demand comes, if the ATO garnishes bank accounts, issues direct penalty notices, they're the early warning signs that people need to jump pretty quickly to get on top of things. Now I'm going to open up the door and let you talk about the banks. So banks are a little bit different.
Banks are a little bit different. Now, for those of you that don't know me, I actually worked in a bank for a little while. I worked for 29 years in business banking. Thought I'd give it a try. Decided I didn't like it. So I'll just talk briefly about banks. And again, there's a difference between their personal debt collection processes and their business debt collection processes. I'll kick off with personal. So with credit cards, of course, the bank wants its credit card money back. It'll do things like send warning letters and so on. Now, important to note that cardholders have a right to request hardship stay from the debt collection, and that can put the bank on ice for around 3 months before they can take any action. Now, banks always have the option of pursuing that cardholder into bankruptcy if they want to, and going through the process that I spoke about, statement of claim, bankruptcy notice, that type of thing. Now, on credit card banks rarely do that on credit card debt. They're much more likely to sell a big bundle of credit card debt to a debt collection agency. So they might sell a big book of credit card debt that they believe is impaired, and they might sell it for 5 or 6 cents on the dollar, and it gets handed over to a debt collection company, and then they start the enforcement process if they want to. So it pretty much all starts over again. The debt collector will send a letter of demand and potentially the statement of claim and so on. Now, personal loans are a bit different. Banks rarely sell personal loan debt to outside debt collection agencies. And their options are there that they either just write the debt off as a bad debt, maybe put a black mark on the borrower's credit record, but they don't pursue it into bankruptcy. They have the right to, but often they just don't. Of course, they could pursue a personal loan into bankruptcy if they wanted to. Home loans are different again. There's a lot of processes and a lot of steps that a bank has to go through to enforce its mortgage that it holds over a residential property. It's all governed by laws in that area. And, it's quite an exhaustive process because the government has put in protections for borrowers so they can't just be locked out of their house overnight. Now, these are generalisations and there's no hard and fast rules, but it can take sort of in excess of 3 months, maybe even 6 months or longer before the bank's able to take possession of a property as a mortgagee. So let's talk a little bit about business debts. Now, the major banks in Australia and even some of the smaller banks have what we refer to as impaired asset departments. Now, there's specialist areas within the bank that are set up to deal with borrowers that the bank believes are at risk of not paying them back or at risk of default. Now, each bank will use different language to describe these areas, and sometimes they try to put a positive spin on it, like specialised business unit or asset restructuring department. It all means the same thing. It's the bad bank. It's where you go when the borrower has been naughty and they're worried they're not going to get paid back. Banks will classify those files, and again, they'll use different terms, but commonly they'll say some files are retain, meaning we want to retain that business, and some files are exit, which means, well, we want them just to go away and we want to get our money back. In these impaired asset departments, there are specialist managers that work in there that are quite senior people, quite senior and experienced business banking managers. On the files that they wish to retain, they'll try to work with that client to come up with a plan. Maybe sometimes it's an asset sale program. Sometimes it's a accelerated amortization or loan repayment program to get that client back to a position that the bank is comfortable with, at which time would it be returned to the normal management. Now, the exit files are different. They're the ones that the bank just wants to go away, that it just wants its money back or as much of its money back as it can get. You know, some people listening might think, well, if you're in trouble with one bank, you can just refinance to another. Well, banks learnt that lesson about refinancing the problem loan from one of your competitors. And now for a client that's already in an impaired asset division, that can be really hard work to get approval to do a refinance. Now, as Ash said, they still have processes to go through. And one thing that Ashley and I find in our work is that sometimes it's easier to negotiate with an impaired asset manager than it is with a local relationship manager, like at the local business centre. These people have greater authority, they have more experience, and they do that work all the time. So from our perspective, they're good people to negotiate with as opposed to the normal manager that's in charge of that file. However, for people listening today, if any friend or associate, family member or client, if that client file is sent to an impaired asset division, that is never a good thing. That's a clear sign that the business has got some problems and that they need some specialist advice. The bank will try to sugarcoat it and say, you know, this is not a bad thing. But going to an impaired asset department is obviously a bad sign and a warning sign that you need a little bit of help. Now, a few years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago, the bank had a propensity to appoint receivers under the securities that they take over companies. Now, they've gone away from that in our experience. We haven't seen very many receiverships at all. From the bank's perspective, receiverships can be expensive, and they had some very disappointing results from doing it. So across the industry now, there's been a real decline in the number of receiverships, with the bank more willing to work that out themselves rather than act on their security instruments. But just to enforce what Ash said, even with business banks and home loans and personal loans, there is still a process to go through, and it still takes quite some time before, you know, it really becomes a desperate thing for the client. All right, Ash, I finally got to say my bit about banks, mate.
We know you love it.
How'd we do?
We did fine.
So, mate, I think that brings us to the part of the topic that we really want to talk about today.
Yep.
And that's about dealing with directors or individuals who are starting to feel the pressure.
Yeah, that's it. That's obviously the primary part. And I think, interestingly, you know, some people have been feeling the pressure for 12 to 18 months. We've had some who have felt none up till now. Like they've had better cash flow, better controllable money coming in through the JobKeeper program and various other grants that they've been, so they haven't really felt a lot, and others have been in this survival mode. But we're now starting to move into a phase where it's actually going to become more of an issue. And that's really what we wanted to cover, is some of the soft skill stuff about how you can manage that going through. But I think one of the things before we get into the process that we're going to talk about is that I want everyone to be really clear. I'm not a mental health expert. We're going to talk through some steps and some options, but I'm not a mental health expert by any stretch of the imagination. I've had to deal with these situations quite a lot over the last 15 years, last 20 years, but it doesn't mean that I'm an absolute expert in this area. So please take this as general information. Not coming from a fully fledged expert in the area.
Yeah, thanks, Ash. Now, the whole discussion around mental health is getting a lot of airplay at the moment, and I understand that many of the accounting bodies have issued or developed some programs to assist accounting firms in dealing with directors and clients that are in distress. Is that right?
Yeah, so CPA and CA both got some programs. They got some funding from the government to help support accounting firms, and a number of the other professional bodies have as well. Yep. So if you are looking for some more specific training, please feel free. Don't feel free. It's obviously you've got the ability to jump in and go and get some of that advice and that support that the government's put some money up for. Today, we're just going to focus on a simple 6-step program, a 6-step process that can help you deal with some of those distress calls as they come in.
So, Ash, where do you start when that call comes in and the client is in a distressed state?
So it's actually, it might sound like a silly thing to say, but the first step is actually just to listen. We find, particularly as advisors, myself, and I've got a family full of girls at home, and they come to you with a problem, you want to come up with a solution. I think it's really important as advisors that we actually take some time and just listen first. Ask some open-ended questions, try and get a little bit more to the detail to actually understand what their real fears are, what their real worries are, what their stresses are. So as I've got on the screen there, be an active listener, but more importantly, be a leading questioner. So ask people, what is it that's really worrying you? What does it worry you about that? Spend probably 3 times as much time as you think you should just chatting with them and listening. Ask a question and then shut up, I guess, is part of the big part of it at this stage. So you'd be surprised how many times just in doing that, the stress levels and the worry levels of someone will come down quite significantly just by being there to listen. Now, in that phase, in this early, the first part of talking to someone who's in a bit of distress is sort of, you need to talk about the worst case scenario, and it's not where I'm going to spend most of today, but for our listeners, it's really important that we do broach the topic. It is something that no one likes to talk about, and that's suicide. Suicide will happen, unfortunately, a lot in this year, and most of the time suicide, there's expectations that it could actually be higher than it normally would be, and the suicide rates in Australia are still way too high. But if you get someone on the phone who is, you're worried about being in that state, it's really important that everyone knows that it's actually a smart thing to do is to actually ask them if they're considering self-harm or considering suicide. In all my years of having to deal with this sort of stuff, I haven't had anyone who's disliked me or hated me for asking the question. If they're not seriously looking at it, they'll thank you for asking but say no. If they are more worried about it or they are thinking about it, then they'll be happy that someone's opened up the door for them to talk about it, as a general rule. Now, if they do want to talk, if it is someone who is thinking about it, this is not what this 6-step program is about. I need to be really clear that if you have concerns and safety worries for someone, get specialists involved. Now, that could be if you're on the phone to them. Most phones now have got very easy conferencing facilities. Conference in 000. They will get you through to the right area. They'll have a specialist on hand that can help deal with the situation. Lifeline's another phenomenal resource. They've got people who specialise in dealing with that. Conference in Lifeline, let them know what's going on. and the operators at the other end of the line are specialists at dealing with the situation, and they will take over the call, and they will eventually slip you out of the call when they can. It's the really bad end of the situation, and it's not something that most people want to talk about, but it's really important that everyone understands that there are options there. You do not need to be afraid to ask, and if it's not that bad, that's great, that's wonderful. But if it is, you need to know that there are options, and it's actually a lot easier to transition them to the right person if you need to. If people want to go into more detail of that, please just give me a call. Outside that, I want to go back to the what we anticipate will be the majority of calls, which aren't anywhere near as strict as rough as this. Interestingly, between our session this morning and now, I've actually had one of our staff someone ring up who had to ask the question, and then we've had to do a few things today to help that person. So it's amazing. It is there, and it will happen. Yeah. But for those outside that area, the key is step one is just about being a very good listener and trying to get to the bottom of. I often ask, what are the big three concerns that you've got, and get them to really drill down on what that is. That's step one, Phil.
Well, I think you make a few really good points there, Ash. And as you said earlier, you're not a mental health expert, neither am I. And we don't expect our listeners to be either. But I think it's good to know that you're not going to get in trouble by just asking that simple question about, are they considering self-harm? Yeah. Also say that, being a good listener, I think, is critical. And I'd say sometimes that from the other perspective, sometimes if I've got a problem at work and I don't know what to do, I might ring you and just have a chat to you about it. Sometimes just me being able to tell you about it helps me think clearly. It explains that I'm actually explaining the issues back to myself, and just be enormously beneficial. That's so listening's the first step, Ash.
Yep.
Give us step two, mate.
The next step, most people would think it'd be going into actioning, trying to deal with it, but it actually isn't. So what's important when you've got someone who is distressed on the phone or in person is once you've heard what their issues are and you've spent some time listening to what their concerns are, is actually to validate them. Let them know that it's actually okay to feel that way. That if you're feeling stressed, if you're feeling sad, if you're feeling worried, whatever the case is, validate the fact that it's actually okay for them to feel that way. They've got good reason to. They've got a lot on their plate. There's a lot to deal with. It's okay to feel this way, because you need to take it off the edge of it, or potentially making it worse. So, validating that their feelings are okay. Don't be really careful not to belittle the issue. And I know for me, sometimes we'll get clients in here with $50,000 tax debts. For them, that's the end of the world. For others, I've got people who come in with $1 million tax debts, and for them, that's not even the end of the world. It's just a bit of a problem they need to deal with. So perspective comes into play, and not belittling their feelings based on what they think their problem is really important. So validating them, letting them know it's actually okay to feel the way they do.
A great point, Ash. I think that's critical, to just sort of validate how they're feeling and let them know that that's okay. Not judge them, not impose your value system on them, but just show them a little bit of empathy and understanding. So that's great, mate. What's the next step in the process that you would recommend?
We're still not quite at action phase yet. So the next stage is actually to normalise it for them. And it's actually, so once you validate their feelings, saying it's okay to feel like that, you need to let them know they're not alone. So, and, I should have said this earlier, that these steps apply both for, someone who's stressed about something personal, whether it be a divorce or separation or, any type of personal issue, as well as it is business issues. And obviously we're a little bit more focused here today on the business issues, but it does relate just as well. Having things saying, if someone's going through a separation and a divorce, that, after you've validated that it's okay to feel that way, just remember though, you're not alone. There are 45% of marriages that end up in divorce. You're not alone in these situations. If it's, it looks like a company's going to go into liquidation or is in liquidation because of a court appointed, there are on average upwards of 7,500 companies going to liquidation every year. The ATO's currently owed $53 billion.
Wow.
So if someone's coming with a tax debt, you're not the only one who owes the tax office some money. So just normalising whatever their fear is, whatever their stressor is, and letting them know that they're certainly not alone in dealing with it, and that there are options out there.
Great point, mate, because people that are under financial pressure, often they suffer from stress or depression. They can feel very alone. They've also got all those feelings potentially of guilt or shame or embarrassment about their financial situation. So letting them know that there's many other people in the same situation than them can just be sometimes a bit of a relief to people, to know that they're not a pariah, they're not alone. There are lots of people in that situation. Mate, halfway through, you're going great. Let's keep going. Let's move on. What's step 4?
So the next step's where we actually get to start taking some steps. So we get out of for want of a better word, the touchy-feely side of it, the warm and fuzzy side, and into actually taking some steps. Now, depending on what the issue is actually helping that client or person or friend make a step. Now, and I don't just mean say, hey, you should give, if it's a legal matter, you should just give a solicitor a call. It's actually getting involved and making sure that the meeting is booked or a phone call is made straight away. So, if they need to see a solicitor, organise and book the meeting with them right there and then get someone on the phone and have a chat about the situation straight away. If it's, if they need to just have new cash flows done or new marketing plans done, then book that meeting with the right person within your firm to actually get that done, and make it happen rather than just, we should get around to doing this. If they need to, if they are in distress and they need to come and see a firm like Jonge, then get on the phone and book that meeting straight away. Get it happening for them, because unfortunately, when people are in a stressed state and a fearful state, you can give them whatever steps you want, but they're not always going to take them. So, I can't tell you how many times I've had someone call me up and say, I've told Billy Bob to give you a call, and Billy Bob never calls. And then it comes back 6 months later, Billy Bob, or 3 months later, Billy Bob's in even more trouble now. I told him he should have called you. When people are stressed and depressed and in all those levels, they won't always make smart decisions by picking up the phone. And as you mentioned, there's often a shame that comes with the fact that my business is in trouble. So ringing up someone they don't know, even though they're recommended, is a hard thing to do. So in this step, it's important that you actually make the next step for them. Hold their hand and actually get it done and get it set up so that they can then move forward. It's not always about sending them to us. I mean, obviously, if they need that type of advice, great. If it is just getting cash flows done, they need to be booked in to see a doctor, if they need to be booked in to see a specialist counsellor, whatever the case may be, don't just tell them what to do. Help them actually do that step. It's really important in this phase to get that done.
Yeah, I know in my experience, actually, with the clients that I've spoken to, sometimes the greatest problem is that they know they need to do something, but they just don't know what it is. They just don't know where to start. And a lot of business people, they're doers, they're hard workers. And there's nothing worse than a doer that doesn't know what to do. I also think it's interesting that we're way through to step 4 before we've actually really taken any action. The rest of it's all been getting the client ready for that step, which is important. Now, I think what I've experienced is that sometimes just having a plan or just having a sense of direction can just make such a huge difference for a client, that they start to see a way forward. So I think that's just absolutely critical. So Ash, keep going, mate. What's the next step in this process? I'm all ears.
But the next step is actually so once you've set up and put those action steps in place, I think we as advisors then have a responsibility to ensure that these things get followed through. So if it's more of a personal nature, just find a reason to give them a call, have a chat to them, In some cases, I'll find an article that's relevant to whatever their issue may be, and send them an email with a link to the article saying, "I read this and thought it might be something of interest to you." If you've sent them off to the solicitor and the solicitor's meeting's a couple of days later, give them a call afterwards. How did that go? Have you got some further steps? Is there anything else we need to do? Making sure that they actually are taking progression towards whatever the first step in the solution. It's not always a one step and then you're at a solution. I mean, if you're going through a version of depression, or you've got a bit of the black dog hanging over you, these things take time and they don't happen overnight. So it is just that follow-up process to make sure that they are continuing to move down a path that hopefully will lead them to a better place than where they are now. So that's the next step.
Okay. So we've got to the point now that we're following up. What do you think's a real critical element in helping a client or a friend or family members that's going through these types of issues, Ash? So what would the next step be? What do you want to, what sort of...
Step 6.
That makes sense, doesn't it?
Look,
what are we going to call that one?
Look, step 6 is actually something that should be happening all the way through, but you've actually got to, coming up with a stepped process. It had to go somewhere. So, and it's about giving them hope and letting them know that they will get through. So, and that comes a little bit back to the value of validating and normalising that you're not the only one doing this, and that there is hope that on the other side of this, things are going to be okay. It might be. I know that I had another client who's been through a liquidation. They've come out the other side, and now they're feeling so much better because they've gone and got a job, or they were able to restructure their business, and now their business is going great guns. You will get through the separation of your marriage, and you will find a way to actually find a new lease of life, and blah blah blah. So whatever it is hope is so powerful, and it's something that should be in all our lives everywhere. And that's very touchy-feely, I know, very very warm and fuzzy. But hope is really a critical thing for everyone in all of human nature, but particularly important when you've got someone who is in a pretty bad financial state or personal mental state.
And I'd say, Ash, that some of the most successful business people in Australia have faced these issues in the past, and they've got through it. And now they're amongst some of the wealthiest people in Australia. And I'd also say that, just bringing it back to Jonge Reed for a minute, that this resonates pretty strongly with us. It hits pretty close to home, doesn't it, Ash?
Yeah, and it is very much so. I mean, for those, most people would know the story of Hank de Jong and our founder and my business partner, of what he had to go through. And our whole business now, nearly 35 staff, is completely and utterly focused on providing that guidance and support and that hand-holding approach to actually helping people through financial distress. And we're very acutely aware of the pain, mentally and emotionally, that people go through when they're in this situation. So, it's a very big part of the ethos of what makes our firm tick is dealing with people in this state, and I guess really understanding and being aware of that and guiding people through this process.
Well, actually, certainly a lot of things that we've spoken about today, and we've covered a lot of ground. And sometimes, our listeners may be able to get through all these steps in the one phone call, but sometimes it may take a series of phone calls before we get there. If I could just bring it back to Jonge Reed for a moment, I think when we get to that action stage in stage 4, that a good action you could take, if necessary, is refer them to Jonge Reed. And for those listeners today that have never referred to us before, or have never worked with us with a client before, what can they expect from Jonge Reed if they do take that action and send their friend or their client to Jonge Reed for help?
That's a really good question, Phil, because I think for anyone here, if you're going to send someone to someone, you want to know that they're going to be looked after and trusted, particularly if you're taking it seriously to look after them. So And we certainly do take it seriously. So if someone does come to us, there's a process that we take them through, which involves, in the first instance, sitting down with them either one-on-one with their advisor or online if need be, and have a chat to them and just talk through all the issues. So what the business is like, what the financials are like, where the pressures are, what are their goals, what are they trying to achieve to get out of, looking at, do they want to keep the business, do they want to get out of the business? All those sort of questions are dealt with in that first meeting. The other big thing, and this comes back, I guess, to step 6, is that 95% of the time, our strategists who sit down with those clients will be able to give them some idea of how we're going to be able to help them get through to the other side. So that leaves them with some hope that there's some option. And I think one of the most common things I hear is that I'll be able to actually go home and have a sleep tonight.
Yeah.
So we do that initial fact finding. We get whatever information we need to together at that point. Then we actually go away, formalise a plan. We'll talk within the team, make sure that we've got the right experts looking at it within the team, and we put together a plan for them. It's a strategy paper is written, and that's a fully detailed plan of how we believe within their goals and within the law, what we can actually do to help them through to the other side. One of the things that Hank and I are very proud about is that before that gets back to the client, is that we actually have to go through a compliance process. Keeps you very busy.
It does.
But every proposal then goes back through our national compliance manager for sign off on both legal and ethical sort of sides of things for any of these type of restructures or any processes that we go through. Once that sign off's achieved, then we'll sit down with the client and the advisor again, if required, and run through a plan and what we believe is the best way for them to get through. And that's a fully costed plan, both our fees and any ancillary costs that we believe are going to be necessary to achieve that plan. Up until that point, all of that's obligation free and cost free for the client. So it gives them an opportunity to actually find out what's available to them as a solution to whatever their issue may be, without any further risk of having to spend a lot more money. And that whole obligation free actually came from the fact that when Hank went through this himself 20 odd years ago, he was in trouble. He was in financial trouble. So going to get new advice and extra advice and trying to get all these experts to have a look at his situation can be very expensive. And if you're short on money, going to have a meeting with someone that might cost you $500 or $1,000 and not know if it's going to help you, that's a big investment. So we wanted to take that component of the stressor and the fear out of it, and that's where the obligation and cost-free plans come from, and that's where the basis of it is. Once the client's got that, they then get to make the decision whether they want us to implement that plan. So that's if someone sends it to us under that action step, that's the process that we will then take them through up until that point.
And I've got to say, Ash, that whole process of being obligation free and getting some advice and a written recommendation, that made me feel really good about working for Jonge. I took that as a real positive sign and good for the client. I think also from the advisor's point of view, that it means that action step's pretty low risk. It's not going to cost your client any money. I've never actually had a client complain that their advisor got them some specialist help too soon. I've heard plenty the other way around though, that if only I'd known I could have done this 6 months ago, So I think that's a really low risk way to try to help a client or a friend or family member that's in financial distress. So Ash, just to finish up with one other question that we get a lot at the moment is that our listeners might identify somebody that they know, a client or a friend or whatever, that they can see that they're getting into trouble. They can see the writings on the wall, but they've not called yet. Sometimes people get in denial, stick their head in the sand, for want of a better term, or they're just eternal optimists that they think they're going to be able to turn it all around. How could our listeners approach a situation like that where they see the issues are there and they want to start the conversation with the client about these potential issues. Let's face it, mate, talking to someone about liquidation or bankruptcy is not necessarily an easy conversation to have.
No, it's not.
What thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one, because you're right. I mean, most of these business owners that we see have spent a lifetime building their business in some form, and it's like another child to them, really. So someone ringing up and saying, I think we need to put your child in ICU, or that we're going to have to go and find a funeral home, is not a conversation that anyone wants to have. But so I think for me, when you're identifying someone who may be at risk, and particularly if they're still in that optimistic phase or in the denial phase, what I often talk about is get them to get a plan B.
Yeah.
So if the optimistic, that next contract that's going to save the day, or the next wave of sales that's coming, or that they're going to get out of this cost quite significantly soon. If those things don't come off, what's our plan B? So, what we do with our proposals and our plans is that we do provide that plan B. Now, sometimes that can be done over the phone. Other times we've had some of our referrers ask if we can put together an email that helps explain that for them, and put some reference around who we are. So I think we're very much the plan B business is we're business consultants, we're pre-insolvency, but we're a company that specialises in coming up with plan B options for businesses. So that's the sort of wording that I generally find works for people when they've asked that question. And whether that be via email or phone or whatever the case may be, they're more than welcome to pick up the phone to myself, or to you or Hank, or any of the strategists and the strategic partnership managers, and they will be able to give you some help and guidance around that wording for those that need that help.
Yeah, I love the idea of a plan B. Maybe the silly analogy that I use sometimes is that business owners are like the person up on the high wire, and we're the ones that put in the safety net underneath. That if it doesn't work out the way they expect, at least they're going to have a much softer landing than they otherwise would.
Yep.
So, but yeah, plan B certainly doesn't help. Certainly doesn't hurt to have a plan B. And
I was going to say, it does help.
It does help, yeah. Certainly doesn't hurt to have a plan B, because it's a very unpredictable world we live in, as we've seen over the last little while.
Absolutely.
So before I sort of close off today, I'd just like to say, I know you're not a mental health professional, mate, but I've known you quite some time, and I don't think I've ever worked with another person that is as passionate about mental health and trying to support people in difficult times than you. And I think that's great, and it adds a lot to our team and to our business. And I can tell just from listening to you speak how passionate you are about this topic. So as you said, if you're worried about having that conversation with a client, you're more than welcome to give any of our team a ring and have a chat about it. And as said, sometimes we'll even help draft an email or help you with some scripting to broach what is a very sensitive and sometimes a difficult topic. Now, thanks again for today, Ash, and I hope that our listeners took something out of today's session and the 6-step process that you've run us through. Before we close off and open the floor to questions, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with?
Oh no, I think we pretty much covered it all now, Phil. I think I as I've said a number of the times all the way through, please, if anyone has any questions about this, would like us to talk to some of their staff about it a bit more. I am very passionate about providing that guidance and support, but again, not an expert in it. But the reality is, I think we're going to see a lot of very different things and a lot of pain and suffering coming up. And I'm not trying to be a doomsayer. It's just let's be real that it is there. It was there before COVID, and it's going to be there after COVID. Whether there's an increase or not, what it has done is allowed us all to start talking about it again a little bit more openly. So if anyone does have any questions, please, you can either put the questions in the chat box, and our marketing lady has put our webinar feedback in place, so please feel free to mark the poll. We won't be offended. although it does help us to make sure that we're providing the right sort of advice. But if you would like to ask a question rather than type it, please just unmute yourself or raise your hand, the electronic hand thing, and we're more than happy to take any questions as they come by. I don't think we've got a lot coming through, so Phil, that either means that we've done a really good job or we've bored everyone stupid and they just want to close off now.
It was a bit of a different chat this month, Ashley, but I think that's a good thing, you know, to touch on a different topic and something that I think is really important at the moment. Now, for those people that do miss the numbers and like the numbers and the case studies, I think we're doing one next month. Our next webinar will be one of our more traditional case study type formats.
Yeah. Okay, well, it doesn't appear that we have any questions. Thank you very much, Kerry, for that kind words. But it doesn't look like we have any other questions, so I will wrap up on that for everyone. Thank you very much for attending. It's we really enjoy providing these to you on a monthly basis, and Phil and I certainly have a bit of fun doing them as well.
Yes.
If I don't speak to you all before, have a great month, and we'll see you next month for our next one of these. So again, once again, thank you very much and goodbye.